So today I finished, for the first time ever, I finished one book in one day. And I gotta tell you, might be, actually, probably is the best history book that I've read because, as I've said before, if you've heard me, I really think it's important to, find authors and whatnot that can really put you in the moment and give you a really good understanding of that time period and how people thought, customs, just things like that. Because today we just have such an Americanized lens point of view that, something that, we deem things as evil so quickly, and we're just so quick to not even take into consideration the world that they lived in. We can't even fathom the world that some of these events took place, the time period and whatnot, just like they could have never envisioned the world that we live in. So I think that's really important. And so the book that I read today is called The Faithful Executioner: Life and Death, Honor and Shame in the Turbulent 16th Century by Joel F. Harrington. And you read the title and you think that they're just going to talk about the executioner and whatnot, and his executions, all that stuff. But man, he does a hell of a job, giving you more than what you thought you were going to get. He goes into great detail about what it was like to live in the 16th century. The area that they lived in was a town called Hof in Germany. He talks about all kinds of different things that to me it was simply amazing, and I thoroughly enjoyed it as I finished it in one day. So I don't want to spoil too much of it if you haven't read this and you want to. So we're just gonna read the preface, and we'll leave it at that. So The Faithful Executioner: Life and Death, Honor and Shame in the Turbulent 16th Century by Joel F. Harrington. And let's get to the preface. There's a couple good visuals in here, but here we go. Starts out with a quote: "Every useful person is respectable," by Julius Krautz. He was an executioner of Berlin in 1889. The sun has barely cleared the horizon when a crowd begins to form on the chilly Thursday morning of November 13th, 1617. Yet another public execution awaits the free city of Nuremberg, renowned throughout Europe as a bastion of law and order, and spectators from all ranks of society are eager to secure a good viewing spot before the main event gets underway. I just that part right there, I'm automatically thinking like old school WWF when I was growing up. Vendors have already set up makeshift stands to hawk Nuremberger sausages, fermented cabbage, and salted herrings, lining the entire route of the death procession from the town hall to the gallows just outside the city walls. Other adults and children roam the crowd, selling bottles of beer and wine. By mid-morning, the throng has grown to a few thousand spectators, and the dozen or so town constables on duty, known as archers, are visibly uneasy at the prospect of maintaining order. Drunken young men jostle one another and grow restless, filling the air with their ribald ditties. Pungent wafts of vomit and urine mix with the fragrant smoke of grilling sausages and roasting chestnuts. Rumors about the condemned prisoner, traditionally referred to as the poor sinner, circulate through the crowd at a dizzying pace. The basics are quickly conveyed. His name is George Karl Lembrecht, age 30, formerly of the Franconian village of Mainberheim. Though he had trained and worked for many years as a miller, he most recently toiled in the more menial position of wine carrier. Everyone knows that he has been sentenced to death for counterfeiting prolific amounts of gold and silver coins with his brother and other nefarious figures, all of whom successfully got away. More intriguing to the anxious spectators, he is widely reputed to be skilled in magic, having divorced his first wife for adultery and whored around the countryside with an infamous sorceress known as the Iron Biter. On one recent occasion, according to several witnesses, Lambert threw a black hen in the air and cried, "See, devil, you have here your morsel. Now give me mine." Upon which he cursed to death one of his many enemies. His late mother is also rumored to have been a witch, and his father was long ago hanged as a thief, thereby validating the prison's chaplain's assessment that the apple did not fall far from the tree with this one. Short before noon, the bells of nearby St. Sebaldus begin to ring solemnly. Joined in quick succession are Ladies' Church on the main market, then St. Lawrence on the other side of the Pegnitz River. Within a few minutes, the poor sinner is let out of a side door of the stately town hall, his ankle shackled and wrist bound tightly with sturdy rope. Johann Hangendorn, one of the criminal court's two chaplains, later writes in his journal that at this moment Lambert turns to him and fervently asks for forgiveness from his many sins. He also makes one last futile plea to be dispatched with a sword stroke to the neck, a quicker and more honorable death than being burned alive, the prescribed punishment for counterfeiting. His request denied, Lambert is expertly shepherded to the adjoining market square by the city's longtime executioner, Frantz Schmidt. From there, a slow procession of local dignitaries moves toward the site of execution, a mile away. The judge of the blood court, dressed in red and black patrician finery, leads the solemn cortege on horseback, followed on foot by the condemned man, two chaplains, and the executioner, better known to residents, like all men of his craft, by the honorific Meister, Master Frantz. Behind him walk darkly clad representatives from the Nuremberg City Council, scions of the city's wealthy leading families, and followed by the heads of several local craftsmen's guilds, thus signaling a genuinely civic occasion. As he passes the spectators lining his way, the visibly weeping Lambert calls out blessings to those he recognizes, asking their pardon. Upon exiting the city's formidable walls through the southern Ladies' Gate, the procession approaches its destination, a solitary raised platform popularly known as the Raven Stone. This is in reference to the birds that come to feast on the corpses left to rot after execution. The poor sinner climbs a few stone steps with the executioner and turns to address the crowd from the platform. Unable to avoid a glance at the neighboring gallows, he makes one more public confession and a plea for divine forgiveness. Then he drops to his knees and recites the Lord's Prayer, the chaplain murmuring words of consolation in his ear. Upon the prayer's conclusion, Meister Frantz sits Lambert down in a judgment chair and drapes a fine silk cord around his neck so that he might be discreetly strangled before being set on fire, a final act of mercy on the part of the executioner. He also binds the condemned tightly with the chain around his chest, then hangs a small sack of gunpowder from his neck and places wreaths covered in pitch between Lambert's arms and legs, all designed to accelerate the body's burning. The chaplain continues to pray with the poor sinner while Meister Frantz adds several bushels of straw around the chair, fixing them in place with small pegs. Just before the executioner tosses a torch at Lambert's feet, his assistant surreptitiously tightens the cord around the condemned man's neck, presumably garroting him to death. Once the flames begin licking the chair, however, it is immediately clear that this effort has been botched, with the condemned man pathetically crying out, "Lord, into your hands I commend my spirit." As the fire burns on, there are a few more shrieks of, "Lord Jesus, take my spirit." Then only the crackles of the flames are heard and the stench of the burnt flesh fills the air. Later that day, Chaplain Hagendorn, now fully sympathetic, confides to his journal, based on the clear evidence of pious contrition at the end, I have no doubt whatsoever that he came through this terrible and pitiful death to eternal life and has become a child and heir of the eternal life. One outcast departs this life, another remains behind, sweeping up his victims' charred bones and embers. Professional killers like Frantz Schmidt have long been feared, despised, and even pitied, but rarely considered as genuine individuals, capable or worthy of being known to posterity. But what is going on through the mind of this 63-year-old veteran executioner as he brushes clean the stone where the convicted man's last gasp of desperate pity so recently pierced the thickening smoke? Certainly not any doubts about Lambert's guilt, which he himself helped establish during 2 lengthy interrogations of the accused, as well as the depositions of several witnesses, not to mention the counterfeiting tools and other incontrovertible evidence found in the condemned's residence. Is Meister Frantz perhaps re-envisioning and ruining the bungled strangulation that made such an embarrassing scene possible? Has his professional pride been wounded, his reputation besmirched, or has he simply been hardened to insensitivity by nearly 5 decades in what everyone considered a singularly unsavory occupation? Normally, answering any of these questions would remain a speculative endeavor, a guessing game without any chance of a satisfactory resolution. But in the case of Meister Frantz Schmidt of Nuremberg, we have a rare and distinct advantage. Like his chaplain colleague, Meister Frantz kept a personal journal of the executions and other criminal punishments he administered throughout his exceptionally long career. This remarkable document covers 45 years from Schmidt's first execution at the age of 19 in 1573 to his retirement in 1618. As it turned out, his final gruesome dispatch of the penitent counterfeiter would be his final execution, the culmination of a career during which, by his own estimate, he personally killed 394 people and flogged or disfigured hundreds more. So what was going through Meister Frantz's mind? Astonishingly, although his journal has in fact long been well known to historians of early modern Germany, 1500 to 1800, very few, if any, readers have attempted to answer this question. At least 5 manuscript copies of the since lost originals circulated privately during the nearly 2 centuries after its author's death, with printed versions appearing in 1801 and 1913. An abridged English translation of the 1913 edition appeared in 1928, followed by mere facsimiles of the 2 German editions, both issued in small print runs. My first encounter with Meister Frantz's journal occurred some years ago in the local history corner of a Nuremberg bookstore. While considerably less dramatic than, say, the discovery of a long manuscript in a sealed vault that opens only after you solve a series of ancient riddles, it was nonetheless a eureka moment. The very idea that a professional executioner from 4 centuries ago might be fully literate, let alone somehow motivated to record his own thoughts and deeds in this manner, struck me as a fascinating prospect. How could it be that no one to this day had made significant use of this remarkable source to reconstruct this man's life in the world in which he lived? And I'll say right there, he does an excellent job of not only reconstructing the man's life, but also the world in which he lived. Here consigned to a back shelf as a mere antiquarian curiosity was an amazing story begging to be told. I purchased the slim volume, took it home to read, and made a few important discoveries. First, Frantz Schmidt was by no means unique among executioners in his self-chronicling, although he remains unsurpassed for his era in both the length of time covered and the detail conveyed in most entries. While the majority of German men in his day remained illiterate, some contemporary executioners could write well enough to keep simple, formulaic execution lists, a few of which have even survived to the present day. By the beginning of the modern era, the executioner's memoir had become a popular genre in itself, the most famous being the Chronicles of the Sanson family, an executioner dynasty that presided in Paris from the mid-17th to mid-19th centuries. The subsequent decline of capital punishment across Europe prompted a final wave of published reminiscences from The Last Executioners, some of which became bestsellers. Still, the continued obscurity of this fascinating figure remained puzzling until I examined the journal more closely and made a second, more daunting discovery. Although Meister Frantz is undeniably riveting in his portrayals of the diverse criminals he encountered, he consistently keeps himself tantalizingly in the background, a shadowy and taciturn observer despite his vital role in many of the events he describes. In this respect, the journal itself reads less as a diary in any modern sense and more as a chronicle of a professional life. Its 621 entries, ranging in length from a few lines to a few pages, are indeed written in chronological order, but in the form of the two lists, the first comprising all Meister Frantz's capital punishment from 1573 on, and the second covering all the corporal punishments he administered from 1578 on, floggings, brandings, and the chopping of fingers, ears, and tongues. Each entry contains the name, profession, and hometown of the culprit, as well as the crimes in question, the form of punishment, and where it was administered. Over time, Meister Frantz adds more background information about the culprits and their victims, more details about the immediate crimes and previous offenses, and occasionally fuller descriptions of the last hours or moments before an execution. In a few dozen longer entries, he provides still more information about the deviants in question and even recreates certain key scenes with colorful descriptions and occasional lines of dialogue. Many historians would not even consider Schmidt's journal a proper ego document, the kind of source, such as a diary or personal correspondence, that scholars look to for evidence of a person's thoughts, feelings, and interior struggles. There are no account of moral crisis brought on by long sessions of torture, no lengthy philosophical discourses about justice, not even any pithy speculations on the meaning of life. In fact, there are strikingly few personal references at all. In over 45 years of entries, Schmidt only writes the words I and my 15 times each, and me only once. The majority of instances refer to professional milestones, for example, my first execution with the sword, without expressing an opinion or emotion, and the remainder appear as random insertions. For example, I whipped her out of town 3 years ago. Significantly, my father and my brother-in-law, both fellow executioners, each appear 3 times in a professional context. There is no mention at all of Schmidt's wife, 7 children, or numerous associates. Not entirely unsurprising, given the focus of the journal. But there is also no acknowledgement of kinship or affinity with any of the crime victims or perpetrators, many of whom he demonstrably knew personally, including his brother-in-law, a notorious bandit. He makes no explicit religious statements and in general uses moralizing language sparingly. How could such a studiously impersonal document provide any meaningful insight into the life and thoughts of its author? The ultimate reason that no one had yet made use of Meister Frantz's journal as a biographical resource, I decided, might just be that there simply wasn't enough of Meister Frantz in it. My project, too, would have been doomed at the outset were it not for 2 important breakthroughs. The first occurred a few years after my initial encounter with Meister Frantz, when, while working on a different project, I discovered the city library of Nuremberg I discovered in the city library of Nuremberg an older and more accurate manuscript of the journal itself than any previously used, whereas the editors of the 2 previous published editions relied on late 17th century copies, both modified by copyists for greater readability. This biographical portrait draws on a copy completed in 1634, the year of Schmidt's death. Some of the variations introduced in the later versions are minor: different spelling of certain words, numbering of the entries for easier reference, slightly divergent dates in a few places, syntactical improvements, in the insertion of punctuation in the later versions. There is no punctuation in the 1634 version, and it's probable that Schmidt, like most writers of his educational background, used none in the original journal. Many discrepancies, however, are significant. Some versions omit entire sentences and add completely new lines of moralizing language. as well as various details culled from Nuremberg's city chronicles and criminal records. These later versions rendered the journal more appealing to the bourgeois of 18th century Nuremberg, among whom these limited edition manuscripts circulated privately. But at the same time, they often robbed the journal of Meister Franz's distinctive voice, and thus his perspective in later editions. The final 5 years in particular diverge radically from the 1634 version, leaving out several entries altogether and omitting the names of most perpetrators, as well as details of their crimes. In all, at least a quarter of the older text varies to some degree from the later versions. The most interesting and useful difference appears at the very outset of the journal itself. In the 1801 and 1913 published editions, Frantz inscribes his work begun for my father in Bamberg in the year 1573. In the version used for this book, the young executioner instead writes Anno Christi, 1573 year. Here follows which persons I executed for my father, Heinrich Schmidt, in Bamberg. The distinction at first sight, a subtle one, in fact sheds light on the most elusive question about the entire journal. Why was Frantz Schmidt writing it in the first place? The wording in the later copy suggests more of a paternal imperative than a dedication, with the elder Schmidt dictating that his journeyman son begin building the equivalent of a professional curriculum for prospective employers. But the older version of the journal specifies that it was the first 5 years of executions, not the writing itself, that Frantz undertook for his executioner father, also mentioned here by name. In fact, as a later reference in the version makes clear, the journal itself was begun not in 1573, but in 1578, the year of Schmidt's appointment in Nuremberg. Looking back, 24-year-old Frantz can only remember his previous 5 years of executions and omits virtually all his corporal punishments, since I no longer know which persons I so punished in Bamberg. This discovery immediately prompted several new questions. Most notably, if Frantz Schmidt did not start writing for his father in 1573, who was he in fact writing for and why? It's doubtful that he intended the journal for subsequent publication, particularly given the sketchiness of most entries for the first 20 years. Perhaps he imagined that eventually it might be circulated in manuscript copies, as was indeed the case, but again, the earlier years are far less detailed or interesting than the city's other competing chronicles, and overall read more like a ledger than a genuine literary attempt. Possibly the journal was never meant for anyone but the author himself. But this raises the question of why he started it when he did, at the time of his appointment as Nuremberg's full-time executioner in 1578, as well as why he steadfastly avoided any mention of private matters. The second key that unlocked the mystery of Frantz Schmidt's journal is a moving document from his later years, now preserved in the Austrian State Archives in Vienna. After spending his entire life in a profession that was widely despised and even officially designated as dishonorable, the 70-year-old retired executioner made a late appeal to the Emperor Ferdinand II to restore his family's good name. The petition was clearly formulated and penned by a professional notary, but the sentiments expressed are highly personal, even surprisingly intimate at times. Most revealingly, the elderly Frantz recounts the story of how his family unjustly fell into their infamous profession, as well as his lifelong determination to avoid the same fate for his own sons. The 13-page document includes the names of several prominent citizens healed by Schmidt, who maintain a sideline as a medical consultant and practitioner, a surprisingly common occupation among executioners, as well as an enthusiastic endorsement from the Nuremberg City Council, his employer for 4 decades. His long service to the city and personal propriety, the councilors declared, had been exemplary, and they urged the emperor to restore his honor. Could it be that the council itself had been the journal's intended audience all along? Was Schmidt's quest to have his honor restored the guiding motive? He might have been the first, but hardly the last German executioner to adopt this strategy. Rereading Meister Frantz's journal entries with this foundational motive in mind, I began to see a thinking and feeling author step slowly from the shadows of what had initially seemed an impersonal account. Thematic and linguistic patterns emerged. Discrepancies and shifts in style grew more significant, and evolving self identity became ever more pronounced. Here was an author utterly uninterested in self revelation, yet one who inadvertently exposed his thinking and passions in virtually every entry. The very subjectivity that later copyists had unintentionally expunged became a gateway, revealing the author's antitheses, fears, prejudices, and ideals. Well defined notions of cruelty, justice, duty, honor, and personal responsibility emerged and, over the course of the journal, converged to provide the outline of a coherent worldview. The journal itself took on a moral significance, its very composition a testament to the author's unwavering, lifelong campaign for respectability. The complex individual who emerges from this reading, supplemented by extensive archival sources, is a far cry from the stereotypical emotionless brute of popular fiction. Instead, we encounter a pious, abstemious family man who is nonetheless excluded from the respectable society he serves, forced to spend most of his time with convicted criminals and the thuggish guards who assist him. Though effectively isolated, the longtime executioner paradoxically exhibits a high degree of social intelligence, a capacity that makes possible both his brilliant professional success and his gradual reversal of the popular stigma oppressing him. Thanks to the broad chronological scope of the journal, we witness the literary and philosophical evolution of a minimally educated autodidact whose journal entries progress from laconic summaries of his criminal encounters to virtual short stories, and in the process reveal ever more of the author's innate curiosity, particularly on medical matters, as well as his moral cosmos. Despite his repeated exposure to the entire gamut of human cruelty and his own regular administering of horrific violence, this apparently genuinely religious man seems never to waver in his belief in ultimate forgiveness and redemption for those who seek it. Above all, we vicariously experience a professional and private life duly animated by a man's bitter resentment of past and present injustices as well as by his unshakable hope for the future. The book that has resulted from all this digging contains two intertwining stories. The first is that of the man Frantz Schmidt, starting with his birth into an executioner family. Starting with his birth into an executioner family in 1554, we follow him through a youthful apprenticeship at his father's side to his independent travels as a journeyman executioner, moving back and forth between his own words, always in italics, and a recreation of his historical world. We become familiar with the necessary skills of a professional executioner, his uneasy social status, and France's early efforts at self-advancement. As he matures, we encounter the legal and social structures of early modern Nuremberg, the middle-aged executioner's relentless attempts to advance socially and professionally, and his concepts of justice, order, and respectability. We also meet his new wife and growing family, as well as a motley assortment of criminals and law enforcement associates. Finally, we witness the blossoming in later life of two increasingly dominant identities, moralist and healer, and in the process capture a glimpse of the inner life of this professional torturer and killer. The accomplishments of his final years are rendered bittersweet by disappointment and personal tragedy, but the steadfastness of his solitary quest for honor remains in itself an object of wonder and even admiration. As the heart of this book lies another narrative, a reflection about human nature and social progress. If there are such things, which assumptions and sensibilities made the judicial violence that Meister Franz regularly administered, torture, and public execution, acceptable to him and his contemporaries, yet repugnant to us in our own times. How and why do such mental and social structures take hold, and how do they change? Certainly, modern Europeans did not enjoy any monopoly on human violence or cruelty, nor on individual or collective retribution. Judged purely by homicide rates, the world of Frantz Schmidt was less violent than that of his medieval forebears, but more violent than the modern United States. On the other hand, measured by state violence, the higher rates of capital punishment and frequent military pillaging of all the pre-modern societies pale in comparison to the total wars, political purges, and genocides of the 20th century. The continuing worldwide practice of judicial torture and public executions alone underscores our ongoing affinity with more primitive past societies, as well as the tenaciousness of the social transformation that allegedly separates us from them. Is capital punishment truly destined to become extinct everywhere, or is the human drive toward retribution too deeply rooted in the very fiber of our being? What was Meister Frantz thinking? Whatever we find out, the godly executioner from Nuremberg will always remain a simultaneously alien and familiar figure. It's hard enough to understand ourselves and those most intimate to us, let alone a career killer from a distant time and place. As in all life stories, the revelations from his journal and other historical sources inevitably leave many unanswered and probable unanswerable questions. In the only contemporary drawing of Schmidt that can be deemed reliable, the steadfast executioner is fittingly turned away from us. Yet, in making the effort to understand Frantz Schmidt and his world, we experience more self-recognition and empathy than we might have expected when engaging with this professional torturer and executioner. The story of Meister Frantz of Nuremberg is in many ways a captivating tale from a faraway era, but it is also a story of our time and our world.